Cathrine de Mecidi is rightfully ranked among the most insidious and cruel women in the history of mankind. She was called the Black Queen, a child killer, poisoner, and instigator of the massacre of Bartholomew's Night. Many subjects hated her, but were even more afraid, and therefore did not risk speaking out against Catherine openly. However, not all accusations were true. Catherine, the powerful Queen Mother of France, was born in Florence on the 13th of April 1519 to Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of the Kingdom of Florence, and his wife Madeleine. Her mother died a few days after giving birth, and her father died a week later. Her father's relatives took over her care. Despite relatives who stepped in to look after Catherine after the death of her parents, the little Duchess was now alone in the world. Nothing could replace parental love and protection. Initially, Catherine was looked after by her paternal grandmother, Alfonsina, but when Alfonsina died in 1520, Catherine was left with her aunt, Clarice. By 1527, the ruling Medicis had been overthrown by a faction that opposed Giulio de' Medici, who had been elected as Pope Clement VII in 1523. Catherine spent 3 years living in convents, her life threatened at times because of her family name, until Clement VII called her to go and live with him in Rome. He cared for her and also arranged her union to the second son of the French king, Prince Henry II. The marriage took place in France when they were both 14 years old. Catherine had now entered into the French royal family, quite a life-changing experience. Catherine's marriage to Henry II was not a happy one. As queen consort following the death of Francis I in 1547, Catherine was totally devoted to her husband, but in reality, she was the third wheel in the relationship. Henry II was deeply in love with his royal mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who had a major impact on Henry's life. Diane was everything Catherine was not. She was supremely self-confident, beautiful, and an aristocrat. Catherine was queen by name only. She had no political power and no influence over the king or the court. She was distrusted by the courtiers as a foreigner and shunned as a commoner. Further complicating her position, she seemed unable to conceive a child. In 1536, Henry's older brother Francis died of fever, and Henry became heir to the throne. It was now more important than before that Catherine give Henry a child, and so she resorted to take remedies to increase fertility, such as placing cow dung on her flour and drinking animal urine. She consulted astrologers and folk healers and, later, the physician and seer Nostradamus, who she elevated to the position of chief physician for Charles IX. Her association with astrology, which was condemned by the Church, as well as with folk remedies, Nostradamus and others like him, is the source of the later claim that she was involved in occult practices. At the same time, however, she was also suspected of being a witch because of her inability to conceive. The proper function of a woman was understood to be childbearing, and those who could not conceive were prone to raise suspicions of witchery because witches were understood to be in league with the devil, who could not generate life, and so were infertile. Catherine was never charged with witchcraft, but there were suggestions by the nobility that the king should divorce her. However, not long after, Catherine gave birth to her first son, Francis II, and afterwards found no difficulty in conceiving further, eventually giving birth to 10 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. When Henry II died in 1559, Catherine's situation at the court changed in an instant. At first, she acted as a political advisor to her eldest son, Francis II of France. Though Henry had allowed her little influence as queen consort, she had previously been made regent by her husband in 1552 while Henry was absent, and she used this brief political experience under Francis II. Then, when Francis died of illness on the 5th of December 1560, her 10-year-old son, Charles IX, became the next king of France. In an attempt to prevent Catherine from taking control, a regency was put into place, but she overcame it and was made governor of France, ruling alongside Antoine de Bourbon, the King of Navarre. Although Antoine was a prince by blood and had been declared the official regent, the arrangement was ultimately approved by Parliament. It was through her sons that Catherine built up her own political power. When Charles IX became of age to rule on his own, she took the title of Queen Mother of France, imposing herself on all governmental meetings and using the influence she had over her son to remain in power. She continued using this strategy, though less successfully, with her next youngest son, Henry III, who became king after Charles' death in 1574. The long regency of Catherine was marked by the French Wars of Religion, a period of war between Catholics and Protestants. Many urban legends depict Catherine as a murderer who hated Protestants, but it is important to note that the reality is quite different. In fact, Catherine spent a lot of her time in power trying to find peace compromises between Catholics and Protestants. She was a fervent Catholic and she wished her country was Catholic. But she also knew the importance of preserving stability in one's realm in order to secure the dynasty. Catherine spent months negotiating a potential marriage between her daughter, Marguerite of Valois, to the Protestant Henry of Navarre, son of Antoine de Bourbon and Jeanne. Although it has been suggested that Catherine proposed the marriage of her daughter Margaret, as part of an intricate plot to lure the leading Protestants to Paris for execution, there is no evidence to support this claim. Once the marriage was agreed, the wedding was arranged for the 18th of August 1572 of that year, and drew Protestants from all over the country to Catholic Paris. Jeanne arrived early and became sick after shopping for the wedding. She died probably of tuberculosis. Rumors spread that she had been poisoned by Catherine through a pair of gloves, but there is no evidence for this. The Protestant leaders, including Admiral Coligny, were all housed in a specific area of Paris, and 3 days following the union came one of the bloodiest events of early modern French history. An assassination attempt was made on Coligny, the military and political leader of the Protestants, as he returned to his apartment. He was wounded in his hand and arm by gunshot and was carried to his chambers. The Protestants suspected the crown of complicity in the assassination attempt. Charles IX and Catherine, fearing they would attack, ordered a preemptive strike, which would become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. On the night of the 23rd of August, it was decided that the Protestant leaders should be eliminated, and the massacre began the next morning with the murder of Coligny, who was assassinated St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in his apartment, thrown out the window, and decapitated. The other leaders were quickly slaughtered, and although Charles IX had called for restraint and an end to the violence, the common people took to the streets, hunting down Protestants and Protestant sympathizers and eliminating them. News of the massacre spread, and more Protestants were murdered in other cities and towns throughout France, resulting in a death toll in the thousands, with a low count at around 5,000 but more likely over 25,000 killed or more. The exact number is difficult to ascertain as many corpses were thrown into the Seine in Paris, and there is no way to know precisely how many were killed elsewhere. The bloodshed is traditionally believed to have been instigated by Catherine. In September 1588, Catherine started to feel weak, and she eventually contracted pneumonia, a lung infection. At the time, the situation in France was at its worst. The authority of Henry III, her favorite son, had been so challenged to the point that, in May 1588, he had to flee Paris as it was besieged by the Catholic League led by the Guises. Catherine spent her time trying to advise her son, but he no longer wished to listen to her. Her illness progressed and she continued to feel powerless as she watched her son's own power being diminished. The previous December, her favorite child, Henry III of France, ordered the assassinations of his enemies Henry, Duke of Guise, and Louis, Cardinal of Guise. Catherine gasped at the horror she was witnessing. She knew that the French people would never forgive such treacherous behavior from a king. She knew it would seal her son's fate. Knowing her son was facing a death sentence, one sanctioned by Rome, must have weighed heavily on Catherine's mind as her life slipped away that December and January. Her lung infection spread further, and on the 5th of January 1589, she gave her last breath in her own bed at the castle of Blois. It is believed she died of pleurisy. The evening of the 5th, Henry carried out an autopsy before the body was wrapped in royal robes. The robes and clothing used were the same used for Anne of Brittany during her funeral and retrieved from the sacristy of Saint Sauveur. This unusual arrangement was due to the fact that the city of Paris and Saint Denis were closed to both Henry III and his mother, the Catholic League having driven them both from the city the preceding spring. Unfortunately, the embalming was imperfect, and as a result the corpse was secretly stashed in a side aisle of a church in Blois. There it remained until 1610, when the second Medici Queen of France, Marie de Medici, ordered it moved to its rightful place at Saint Denis. By her end, Catherine had become a force to be reckoned with. From orphan to queen consort, to queen mother, she drastically influenced French history by producing 3 of the nation's kings. Though the Valois dynasty did not prevail after Henry III, Catherine's grandchildren from her other children went on to shape late 16th and 17th century politics. In many ways, she was the grandmother of early modern Europe.